Well, hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, an interview series produced by Hong Kong Watch. And it's a huge pleasure to welcome as our guest today, Alicia Kearns. Alicia is the chair of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, elected to that role last year. Also the chair of the China Research Group and member of Parliament since 2019 for Rutland and Melton, and had worked before coming into Parliament in the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of Justice, and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And since being in Parliament, she's been a particular champion of human rights in Hong Kong and China. So Alicia Kearns, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, it's a great pleasure. Let me start by asking, you've recently taken up these two really important positions on the Foreign Affairs Committee and the China Research Group. How did you get particularly involved in Hong Kong and China specifically, and then foreign affairs more broadly?
So in terms of Hong Kong and China, it was actually when I was first working in the Foreign Office that I became interested in China. I was working in the counter-Daesh unit, so working on how to defeat the terrorist group ISIS. And there were lots of these reports coming out in multilateral forums, in public debate about the Uyghur terrorist problem. And I became very interested in this because I was very interested in the idea that China was putting across there was mass migration from the Xinjiang region to Iraq and Syria, individuals wanting to perpetrate jihad and live in this new caliphate. And so I started looking into it, and that's when I became aware of the Uyghur genocide. And that for me was so barbaric, and I really struggled to understand how this was really happening, that this was true. And I started to ask questions within the Foreign Office about this narrative that was coming out, because it seemed to me that there was, even if there was a small, and I mean really minute number of people who had any sort of affection for Daesh, if you looked at the industrialized nature of the genocide, which has been taking place since the 60s, although it's really kind of ramped up in the last 2.5 decades, it seemed impossible to me that these arguments were not being perpetuated and reinforced and doubled in order to push the narrative of the Chinese Communist Party. And I received quite strong pushback because the China desk was not really working with the Middle East desks and wasn't really very connected. And so that started my interest really. And then in 2019, when I was standing for election, I talked about the Uyghur genocide in my election manifestos and discussions and hustings in my local constituency. And then when I came to Parliament, obviously, we started off the conversation with Huawei, which was very important, but I was absolutely determined to be a voice for those who others seek to silence. So it was in my maiden speech that I actually referenced what was going on in China.
That's really fascinating background. In the few years that you've been in Parliament since 2019, the situation in Hong Kong, of course, has changed very rapidly and very dramatically. We saw the police brutality in 2019, the national security law in 2020, and the dismantling of the free press, and of course the exodus of Hong Kongers coming to the UK. What's your analysis of the crisis in Hong Kong and also the response of the UK government to it?
So I think what's happening in Hong Kong is absolutely devastating. And I think 20 years ago, if you'd said this is what was going to happen, there would have been concerns the first few years. But I think really for the last 15, we've been so confident that Hong Kong had found its way, had established itself as a place of prosperity, of independence, of freedom of speech, freedom of mind, a real opportunity. And now what we're seeing is freedom of speech criminalized. Too many political leaders have had to seek refuge here in the UK. And it's really heartbreaking because it's completely manufactured by the Chinese Communist Party. And to see such an enormous crackdown on such a vibrant society, I've only been able to visit Hong Kong once, but it's really quite devastating to see. And there is no question that the government has acted too slowly on Hong Kong. We continue to see a stranglehold over basic human rights, and we continue to see enormous bravery from people in Hong Kong. But sadly, I have to look to people like you, Ben, and Hong Kong Watch for guidance of where we go from here. Because for my part, my job is to continue to be a voice for those Hong Kongers, to continue to listen to Hong Kongers and to advocate in their name however they would like me to do so.
Does it surprise you that even though China has dramatically broken its promises under an international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And even though the United States has imposed sanctions on Hong Kong officials and Beijing officials for what they've done to Hong Kong, the British government has, apart from the very generous B&O scheme, which is helps Hong Kongers, has basically done nothing to hold Beijing to account or ensure that there are consequences for what they've done.
So I am enormously proud of the B&O asylum process, and that was absolutely right, because we have a unique duty to the people of Hong Kong, one that we legislated for, that we signed a piece of paper promising to do. So it's not like many of the other crises around the world where we step forward to try and help people. We have a duty and one we have to uphold. So yes, I do think it is important that the UK does not allow Hong Kong to somehow be forgotten, that we do not forget our duties when it becomes difficult. And I think this is something the UK is trying to now establish, is how do you not just compete with China economically, but how do you contest them? How do you take a stand? How do you make clear that there are lines that will not be crossed? Because democracy and diplomacy is not just about making friends. It's about setting red lines and making sure that certain freedoms will not be crossed. And the people of Hong Kong expect that of us. And we do have the duty to do so. So yes, the UK must not allow Hong Kong to become forgotten. And they must do what they can, but it is also an incredibly difficult operating environment.
Mm. The UK does have now its Magnitsky sanctions regime, and it has introduced bespoke sanctions in the case of a number of other countries. Do you think there is a case for, and do you think there's any chance of the UK either applying Magnitsky or setting up bespoke Hong Kong sanctions?
So I very much welcome Magnitsky sanctions. I think they are so important. But the challenge here is that the point of sanctions is not actually to punish. The point of sanctions is to deter and to change behaviour, and then to be able to relinquish sanctions again once they've been effective. I'm not convinced that with the Chinese government and their activities in Hong Kong that we would be able to deter in any way, that we would even be able to limit the worst excesses of their behaviours within Hong Kong, let alone that sanctions result in an absolute outright turn and change of behaviour altogether. So although I would welcome them as a message that they would send, and we do know that many Chinese have strong economic interest in the UK, so there is a chance they could genuinely have an impact. Where we think they could have an impact, then we should do so. But it would be very clearly in the form of punishment rather than to deter or to change things. And so for me, yes, at this point, we do need to punish if that's the best we can do. But we should also be looking at what more we can do in order to deter and to actually meaningfully change behaviour.
Absolutely. You were particularly vocal, one of the many issues that you've spoken out on the Manchester incident, where the Chinese consular staff, including the Consul General himself, violently assaulted peaceful Hong Kong protesters. What are your reflections on the British government's response to that appalling incident and what we can learn from it for the future?
Yeah. So we can never stand for people being brutalised and hospitalised on our streets, let alone people who've come to this country to seek refuge, let alone in response to people peacefully protesting and expressing their rights and freedoms and their views. I found this a particularly egregious incident because what we are seeing in China is creeping transnational repression. I think this is one of the core tenets of their geopolitics at the moment. And by that, I mean they are actively trying to suppress and silence anyone who would criticise and speak out against them, or those who would whistleblow and reveal the truth. What they are trying to do is suffocate the ability of politicians around the world or individuals around the world to speak up for what is for those who need it, and to speak out against the actions of the Chinese Communist Party. It's probably the most angry I've ever been with the Foreign Office in my time as a politician or as a former employee of the Foreign Office. Because if we are not willing to take a strong position when the Chinese are committing barbarity, and that's what it was brutalization of Bob Chan. If they are brutalizing people on our streets and we are still not willing to take meaningful, strong action, what message does that send about what we will do on the world stage? It suggests that we will cede ground in multilaterals. It suggests that we will not take a strong position on human rights for those who need us around the world. It suggests that we will not stand up to contest and combat the worst excesses of Chinese geopolitics in different parts of the world. And that is so wrong. So those individuals, the 6 individuals that the police wanted to question, They should not have been given a week's notice to leave the country, and they should have been declared persona non grata once they had left country. But it does seem to me that once the deadline had passed by which they had to have left the country, some of them had not, and even then they were not arrested. So from a nation, China, who responds to strength and who I believe compartmentalizes a lot of discussions and is quite transactional in the way in which they deal with many things, this would have been a sign of strength and a sign that we will not accept these sorts of activities on our soil, and that would have made us stronger at home. But we should be very clear this policy of transnational repression is about strategically engineering weakness within our system so that we cannot be strong abroad, let alone at home.
Absolutely. One of the most high-profile cases in Hong Kong is, of course, the case of Jimmy Lai, who, as you know, is a British national. Was just yesterday a hearing of the all-party group on Hong Kong, specifically on his case. What more do you think Britain should be doing for him and for other British nationals who are in prison in Hong Kong? And why do you think the British government has seemed so reticent to speak out about him in particular?
So I think the attacks on Jimmy Lai are entirely politically motivated. We should be ceding no ground when it comes to consular access. A lot of countries want to hide behind claims of dual nationality, and even if it's not dual nationality, they just don't want to respect basic consular access. We should be making sure and clear to China that if they do not allow us consular access, we will walk out of their speeches at different meetings in international fora. We will respond. We will not support them bilaterally. There will be repercussions. The problem with the way in which we deal with high-profile special consular cases or state hostage taking, which this is not state hostage taking in that they are not trying to use Jimmy Lai to get something from the British government, but it is arbitrary detention. He should not be being held. This is not a legitimate court case or a legitimate legal system. The Foreign Office is often too timid to comment on the legal systems of others. But where we accept that it is arbitrary detention, which I believe the government does when it comes to Jimmy Lai, we should be doing everything we can. So we should be attending every court hearing and sitting in that court hearing, sitting outside the court hearing to make sure the Chinese government know we're there. We shouldn't be compartmentalizing those who are being mistreated by other governments because of their abusive legal systems. And we should be making sure that this is part of every single conversation we have with the Chinese government. What we should also be doing is making sure that we know who within the Chinese government has the authority to free Jimmy Lai or to at least significantly improve his conditions. And we should be relentlessly identifying one individual who relentlessly has that conversation with them until we get an improvement in his case. We have to get far more strategic in the way we protect those who are our people around the world, and we cannot allow other countries to try and deny British rights to British citizens.
Absolutely. Well, that's a very powerful message. I want to just move the conversation in the final few minutes to broader China-related issues, and in particular, both in light of, I know you've spoken out on this a lot, but in light of the announcements on TikTok, including an announcement I just saw a few minutes ago about TikTok on parliamentarians' phones. What are your views on these recent announcements, and do they go far enough?
So look, I've been calling for a ban on TikTok for a long time on government devices and on parliamentary devices, so I very much welcome this. What's interesting about the parliamentary devices is it's also a ban on using TikTok on the parliamentary Wi-Fi, which therefore essentially extends the personal devices of all MPs and all MP staff. So I think that's a very smart move by parliamentary security. Look, people are often confused when I don't call for a national ban, and I know that the Americans are currently saying that unless ByteDance sells TikTok, they will ban it nationally. The reason I haven't called for a ban on it nationally isn't that I don't think TikTok is incredibly dangerous. I don't think there are questions around the algorithm data sharing. I don't think there are appalling risks around political viewpoints being controlled and manipulated. The reason I haven't is because we need a national discussion in this country about our data. The average person in the UK does not think when they download an app about the data that they are sharing with that app and who that app might be sharing that data with, how much they're using it, or how they could exploit it, or how vulnerable they make it. Our data is probably the most sensitive thing that we own as individuals. Our networks, our friends, our contacts, how we like to spend our time, what our interests are, whether they be good, positive, normal, or malign, or sensitive, or in some way making us vulnerable. What our thoughts are, what our political interests are, our locations, all these different things make us so vulnerable. to identity thieves, let alone to hostile states. So I don't want to just ban TikTok, because that actually shuts down the conversation and people move on. I think there'd be a lot of protests, but then people would move on. I want everyone in this country to be discussing why TikTok is a risk to their data and why China is pursuing techno-authoritarianism as a geopolitical priority. Why are they trying to create strategic dependence and engineer the strategic interest in apps they won't allow their own people to have access to? If we can have that national conversation, then people will go through a process of critical thinking where they themselves will make the decision to reject TikTok and to reject other technologies that act in the same way. That will then also help us in the wider fight against disinformation and those who are pursuing hostile narratives. We need more critical thinking in our societies, and banning them prevents that from taking place.
That's fascinating. A final question, moving to another aspect of sorry, a penultimate question, if I may, moving to another aspect of China's role on the world stage. We've just seen Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin meeting in Moscow. What are your thoughts on the implications of that?
So for me, it doesn't really change much of the thinking, in that the reason why these two leaders are so aligned with each other is it comes down to survival. That is always what the priorities will be for them. It hasn't changed. But what's really interesting for Xi Jinping is that if I was him, my priority when it came to my near neighborhood would be having a subdued Russia. China has never been able to have one before, because under imperial times, under Soviet times, China and Russia have had their own complexities in their relationship and their own kind of border disputes. But a subdued Russia, reliant on Xi Jinping, in need of Xi Jinping, that means that Xi doesn't need to worry about the entire enormous border that he has with that country. He doesn't have to worry about a democratic rules-based system partner moving in next door, which would be more of a threat to him. He also has someone else where they agree that sovereignty is more important than individual rights, where they can share their grievances and discuss on that. But they also have economic interests. So Russia has a lot of commodities they want to sell, but they want access to technology and to skill set. That's what China provides. And as I say, their political interests are aligned. So for me, there's nothing that surprising about the meeting between them. It confirms that Xi Jinping has no issue meeting with somebody who's been indicted for war crimes just a week after he was indicted for it, because if you look at what Putin is doing with the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, it's textbook what they've done in Tibet to over 1 million children and what they're doing in Xinjiang province as well. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if we found out that Russia had done some sort of study visit to understand how to commit genocide on that scale when it comes to children. So for me, it comes down to border management, security, and foremost the survival of the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping's power. So it's not a big surprise to see them coming together.
Absolutely. Well, perhaps if I can ask a final question, and I could just put 2 points together. I wonder if you have a message for people watching this, particularly Hong Kongers, and if you have a final thought on, in this world where it does seem to be more and more a clash between freedom, democracy, and the rule of law versus a different world order that Xi Jinping and Putin want, what more should we be doing to stand up for our values here at home and for Hong Kongers and beyond?
So I think, look, for my part, we have to recognise that we have a requirement as a country to protect our people, and that means whole of society resilience. We have to recognise that China is strategically pursuing policies of transnational repression, techno-authoritarianism, resource weaponization, and that we are ceding ground to them in too many places. For me, when it comes to Hong Kong and other places, that is where the biggest problem lies, the ceding of the ground. In multilaterals around the world, the institutions that we rely on to uphold the international rules-based order, time and time again, we have ceded ground, whether it be failing to put up our own candidate, for example, to be in charge of Interpol, or whether it's allowing China and other countries to take up positions on UN working groups where they have no place having any authority, or whether it be the way in which we've allowed them to buy up votes from other countries around the world. When we criticize multilaterals, we should actually be looking in the mirror, because multilaterals are a product of their members. We have a duty to make sure that the multilateral system works harder for those who need it most. The reality is that Britain doesn't rely on the multilateral system as much as other countries do. So therefore, it is our duty to make sure the multilateral system works harder for them, and we cannot keep ceding ground. So that for me is my biggest ask of the Foreign Office when it comes to multilateral efforts and multilateral ambitions. Stop ceding ground, but we also have to make sure that within the UK, people aren't worried about illegal Chinese police stations, or that they're going to be beaten up by Chinese diplomats, or that we're going to have Uyghur refugees being bought out by the Chinese police threatening their loved ones at home. Have to take a stand at home as well, because otherwise we can't offer refuge to people and we lose our entire ability to operate internationally. And finally, I would just say that I'm so sorry to all those who have loved ones in Hong Kong and those in Hong Kong who are struggling and fighting for their right for self-determination and to make your own futures and to have your own say on how you live your lives. And I can only hope that we can be more effective in the next few years at shoring up your liberties and fighting for them. But know that with Ben, you have someone who fights for you tirelessly, and so many of us in Parliament will continue to do everything we can.
Well, thank you so much. We hugely appreciate everything that you do in Parliament. Really grateful for your time. Now, there's so many other questions I could ask, but I know you have a busy day, and we've come to the end of this episode. So, Alicia Kearns, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you. And thank you to everything Hong Kong Watch does. And thank you for having me.
No, it's a great pleasure. Thank you.